Well, good evening, friends. Welcome back to Between the Shadows. This is Kristen.
This is Kara.
Alrighty, y'all. Here we are.
Mm-hmm.
The Dream Curse, Part 2.
Part 2.
Part 2.
All right.
Dose, whatever language you speak, Part 2. So it's a pretty quick lead-in. We're just going to continue the story here. We left off with the death of Dr. Lang.
Yeah.
We left off with, who was the last person to have the
Julia.
dream? Julia was.
And she's really, really fighting the urge, but right now they're in the middle of this experiment, and they're probably at this point now less than 24 hours down to needing to complete it.
Yep.
And she's
got to get this bug off her back.
She hasn't told Mrs. Johnson yet, but she's on the brink, and she's breaking.
She is. So that's where we are. Quick lead in. Let's just get right into it. Mm-hmm. So we left off. David has returned from his trip. We're not real sure where he went. Probably Boston.
He always goes to
or
Boston.
Bangor. Yeah.
Bangor.
And this is his first meeting with Cassandra.
Mm-hmm.
He's very subdued, and it's very hard to tell how David feels about Cassandra in this moment. He doesn't seem happy or upset, but I think he seems very confused about the whole thing.
He's always been kind of a blank child anyways.
Yeah, exactly.
Emotionally.
And honestly, I think David is always kind of out to please his father, even though they butt heads often.
Yeah.
So I think he's afraid to make a judgment at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Roger tries to get a reaction out of him, but But David just tells him that if he's happy, then David's happy too.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really seem to satisfy Roger, but that's kind of where we're left at in that first meeting. Next, we see Tony Peterson. He's waiting for Cassandra at the gazebo again. And he thinks that Cassandra, is responsible for Eric Lang's death.
Mm-hmm.
And he says he remembers stealing the talisman for her from Dr. Lang's house, but he doesn't know why he did it. But he thinks that she is responsible.
Yeah.
And, all this time he's been under her power, but, Angelique has a way of making them forget that they did anything for her.
Right.
And instead of addressing it, she hypnotizes them again.
Yeah, Tony's one of those people. Yes, he did succumb to the witch's power, but he was also one of those people that you still had to keep extra hypnotized and all that because he was still hip and still that strong in mind to fight it at least that much, to still be kind of sound of mind while under the curse,
I have a question, though.
Okay.
I'm just curious. I want to get your thoughts on this, but do you think that Angelique used Tony Peterson because he resembled Trask so much?
Obviously it was never what's the word? Hinted at.
It was never addressed, but just
never
curious.
At all, but I have thought about it. About it, and it would be a perfect little pawn and kind of get back laugh for Angelique, to make her feel good because, yes, I mean, he was the witch hunter.
I've kind of wondered about that, because Tony, we've kind of speculated on this, that maybe Tony, his lineage is the Trasks. Maybe we just don't know, but it's something to speculate on. But I wondered about that if she chose Tony because he closely resembles,
and she even let it be known, right? Like there was some point I feel she might have made a comment that to herself or whatever that he actually resembled Trask.
Maybe
I can't remember exactly.
I mean, there is one moment
that could be my mind.
Maybe I can't quite remember, but there is a moment where they have a seance and Tony is part of the seance because they're trying to reach Trask. And Trask speaks through Tony, and all of a sudden Tony Peterson sounds remarkably like Reverend Trask.
Dude, Jerry Lacey, baby.
Yeah.
So that switcheroo.
So I don't know. That was a little buddy trouble, but I just wondered. But so she hypnotizes him again and asks for his help with Julia keeping the dream curse to herself.
Yes,
She just wants Tony to follow her and find out why she's resisting.
Right.
Once he snaps out of her spells, she convinces him that he's falling in love with her, and they share a kiss. Just as David walks up and sees it. Yeah. David has just gotten home, doesn't know how he feels about Cassandra, but sees Cassandra lay one on him,
Yeah.
And so once she's back at Collinwood, Roger tells her that they are all set to go on their honeymoon and they should pack. And she obviously doesn't want to go because that would mean not being able to work her witchcraft at Collinwood.
You can't sprain your ankle again, so what's the next excuse?
Are you going to die? But David comes back from being outside and finds her alone in the drawing room, and he confronts her head on. Like, David don't waste no time. He tells her that he saw her and Tony and the gazebo kissing, and he plans to tell his father about it.
Mm-hmm.
And David is like, he is on one. He's like, he accuses her of, you don't love my dad. You don't love her at all. And Cassandra, oh, well, screw you, little boy, causes him to lose his voice.
Mm-hmm.
And she immediately calls for Roger to tell him what happened. This is her ploy to stay at Collinwood.
Yeah.
And Roger gives David a pad of paper and a pencil. He tries to write and he can't. But in this situation is exactly what Cassandra wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And Roger postpones their trip until David is better.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so back at Dr. Lang's, Julia and Barnabas are going back and forth about the importance of doing the experiment this night, but Julia cannot focus long enough because she cannot stop thinking about this dream.
Yeah.
And there's a knock at the door. Now, we don't expect it to be Mrs. Johnson, because why would it be?
Right.
But they open the door, and there she is. It's Mrs. Johnson. And Mrs. Johnson's like, I have no idea why I'm here. I felt compelled to come here.
Yeah.
And Julia, it's right on her lips. It's on the tip of her tongue. And she fights with everything in her not to spill the details of the dream, but she cannot resist any longer. She tells Mrs. Johnson the dream. And all of a sudden now she can focus. And she focuses on Lang's notes.
Yeah. So now that she's relieved, she's studying. She's studying Lang's notes, and there's another knock at the door.
Yeah.
It's Vicky, and she wants to talk to Barnabas about why he's leaving Collinsport, about his little note that he left. And he tries to explain without really explaining as best he can.
Yeah, yeah.
He says his cousin will be here in a few days, and this is the story he's been telling the whole family. When his life force goes into Adam, the story is that Barnabas has left, and Adam will be coming and staying in the old house.
Yeah, he will basically be there in place of Barnabas.
Basically, yeah.
Then he tells her that loving him, for Vicky to love Barnabas, it would have been the greatest mistake of her life.
Yeah.
And let's think about this for a second. What was the curse that Angelique put on Barnabas?
No one will ever love you.
No one will love you.
And anybody who does will suffer.
And will die.
And will die.
And I think that's what he meant by that comment, that loving him would have been the greatest mistake of her life.
Yeah.
And
can't chance it.
Right. So he sends her back to Collinwood with the excuse that there's a storm overhead because it's Collinwood and there's always a storm overhead. So the experiment begins again. And at first, it looks like Julia's failed because Barnabas is still alive. But Adam opens his eyes and Barnabas realizes they are both alive. Both of them. And Lang expected this. You know, he said this is one of a couple of things that could happen. And, you know, that's why he recorded the message on the tape that they still have not heard yet, that they will never hear. But Barnabas doesn't know what to do because Lang didn't tell Julia that this was a possibility. He didn't tell her that both of them could end up living. And they realize very quickly that Adam is much like a child and cannot speak or understand much of anything, and they worry that Adam is a monster. But they also realize that Barnabas has enormous power over Adam because he is the one whose life force is at least partially alive in Adam.
Right.
Because they're both alive now. You know, he kind of, I don't know, split it down the middle or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
And at first, they're not sure if Barnabas is going to become a vampire when night falls.
Yeah.
And... But night falls, and they discover that Barnabas has been cured of his vampirism.
Yeah, so far so good.
So far so good. But they learn that Adam has completely destroyed the lab where he was created, mostly because everything scares him. He doesn't understand anything. He's a baby. He's a baby, but he's a grown man, you know. Barnabas comes in the lab with a gun drawn, not realizing that if he kills Adam, he'll revert back to being a vampire.
Right.
And after his very large tantrum, Adam passes out like a little baby, you know, and Julia talks Barnabas out of killing him and explains to him that he's just like a child and needs to be given the chance to learn like any child would. Yeah. And Julia gives him an injection and they decide to move him to the basement of the old house so they can start teaching him, you know, how to be a man and speak and, you know,
get out of Lang's house so that can be closed and we'll move on.
Exactly. Yep.
Back at Collinwood, Mrs. Johnson is watching over David, who has still lost his voice. And when she leaves to get him something to eat, Cassandra hypnotizes him and forces him to not remember what happened at the gazebo and causes him to fall asleep. Mm. But when he wakes up, he can speak again, and he doesn't remember not being able to speak or anything.
Yeah, he tells his dad, he's like, I feel great. Like, I'm great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, he doesn't remember a thing. Cassandra was successful, whatever. But this is because, this is all because Mrs. Johnson wouldn't sleep because she was so worried about David. Right. She wouldn't sleep. She's been up for like 2 days.
Right.
I think is what Cassandra said. She's like, you've been up for 2 days. You need to sleep.
Right.
And once David is okay, she urges Mrs. Johnson, you come here and sit on this couch. I'm going to make you sleep, seeming to be caring about it, but really, that ulterior motive, she just wants her to sleep so that this stupid dream can continue.
Yeah.
And I mean, Mrs. Johnson, she's so loyal to the family, especially to David. She cares so much for him. And even after he seems okay, she still refuses to sleep. Mm-hmm. And I just, it brings me back to where Sarah Johnson first came on the scene. Mm-hmm. She came on the scene as a spy she was Bill Malloy's housekeeper. Mm-hmm. And Burke Devlin engaged her, get a job at Collinwood, spy on the family. Yeah. And Bill Malloy is gone. Burke Devlin is gone. But Sarah Johnson is still here. Mm-hmm. Sarah Johnson is still here and becomes very loyal to the Collinses. Yep. And she stays very loyal until the end.
And again, quickly, that's what we talked about before, Elizabeth's never-ending hospitality and just love as a human being, period. Yeah. Just caring.
And I think Mrs. Johnson's demeanor softened also.
Absolutely.
Because I remember her. Too. I remember her in the diner when Maggie was, behind the bar and, serving. She would complain about how the mayo didn't taste fresh or anything. And right. I mean, Mrs. Johnson, some of that never left her. But
she was like borderline crotchety.
Yeah. And I think she lost some of that when she came, once she started working for the Collinses and she was no longer a spy for Burke. But yeah, I think Cassandra knew what she was doing. Mm-hmm. She, it affected every person surrounding Barnabas, even though Angelique didn't know any of these people. I mean, of course, they looked very familiar to her. She chose, I'm convinced now that she chose Roger because of his close resemblance to Joshua, and some of his mannerisms are the same as Joshua, and Joshua wasn't affected by the curse. Yeah. So she chose Roger as, the only single Collins that was, eligible other than Barnabas, but there was no way she was getting in with Barnabas not looking like Angelique.
Oh yeah. But
so I don't know. So I think I'm going to go ahead and say it because we're getting into the dream curse, and I want to mention the one person who wasn't affected by the dream curse was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is the image of Naomi Collins. Yeah. And if we remember back to 1795, Naomi was the only one who was kind to Angelique. And I think Angelique remembered that. So she didn't allow the dream curse to touch Elizabeth. And that's what I kind of like to think. I think that she didn't allow Elizabeth to suffer the dream curse because she reminded her so much of Naomi. And Naomi was kind to Angelique in the past. She's like, if you'll respect this, then, you will always have my friendship and I'll give you the old house, and I don't know. That's just where my mind is. But
I got to say this while we're on track. But saying that, she had something more in store for Elizabeth because Elizabeth spoke up and she was more brave than Naomi.
That's true.
She was more, and Elizabeth suffered something more horrible than the dream curse.
I have to agree with you there. I have to agree. And I didn't think about that.
The fear she put her through in her mind and then actually burying her.
Following through.
I don't want to get ahead, but.
Following through, yeah.
There was something more in store for Elizabeth for how strong she stood up and how strong she was.
I would have to agree with that.
And she still got through it, but we'll get there.
Yeah, so that's where we are. So Cassandra ends up sitting Mrs. Johnson down on the couch, feeding her some broth and making her at least take a nap. And again, this seems like kindness from Cassandra, but we know it really isn't. This is just to continue her curse. Mm-hmm. So the dream comes to Mrs. Johnson. She goes through the song and dance of the dream curse, of the dream sequence, and David is her summoner.
Yeah.
And I mean, Mrs. Johnson cared so much for David that she would have done anything in her power to save David from the terror of that dream curse. So,
right.
I mean, Cassandra probably had it in her head that, oh, I'm just going to hurt Mrs. Johnson. I'm going to hurt David. But I'm not sure if she knew completely the willpower that Mrs. Johnson had not to tell David.
Yeah. She thought she wasn't sleeping before.
Yeah.
And now she really didn't want to sleep now.
Right.
And tell David the dream.
Right. Exactly.
So.
And yeah, I mean, she didn't even take that into consideration that Mrs. Johnson didn't sleep just because David wasn't speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so back at the old house, Julia and Barnabas have put Adam in right about the same place that Barnabas held Maggie for all that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they, of course, engage the help of Willie to help guard and take care of Adam. They tell him, he could strike out at him. He could be, he has to be cautious and friendly and gentle with Adam. And they've realized that Adam reacts to pain in a hostile way. Yeah. So they warn Willie just to talk to him and not be rash or act frightened by him,
Yeah.
And the first thing that Barnabas teaches Adam, he teaches him how to shake hands. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I don't think Barnabas was a very good teacher for Adam. And he admits this later on.
Yeah.
And, he's like, you're not going to find me a good teacher. I'm sorry. He's like, I've lived for so long. I just expect people to know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Willie was the best person to take care of Adam. One, because he's fresh off the funny farm. And two, because Willie doesn't have that mentality about him.
No.
I mean, he's a good handyman. He does incredible work. But
he's not a leader. He's not.
And he's not a babysitter.
Anybody to look up to.
I mean, if we remember when he was watching over Maggie when she was supposed to be Josette, mm-hmm. he wasn't really good for her then either. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But, I mean, what other option do they have at the moment?
Exactly.
So the only way Barnabas has been able to teach anything to anyone is if he puts them under his power, which thanks to Adam, he can no longer do.
Yeah.
So if we're being honest, Willie, he sits down to watch over Adam, and he sits down and lights up a smoke and just begins to talk to Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And Adam, in his curiosity, tries to grab the cigarette, but burns himself, and he freaks out because,
mm-hmm.
That's what he does when
mm-hmm.
he experiences pain. And Willie just gets completely spooked and runs out of the room without securing it, so Adam escapes too.
Yeah.
And we have many instances of Adams escaping this room, many instances. And Mrs. Johnson, who is trying to contain herself and terrified that she's going to run into David and tell him the dream, the same thing that Julia has gone through. Julia urges her, just leave Collinwood so you won't be tempted to tell David,
Right.
And Willie comes tearing into the room looking for Julia to tell him that Adam has escaped. He's lost in the woods like a scared kid,
mm-hmm.
And Willie just wants to tuck his tail behind, between his legs and hide. He wants to find somewhere to hide.
Yeah.
Because he's so terrified of this guy. It's like he doesn't even know how to hurt you, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
But Julia was like, we got to find Barnabas. We need to find him. And Adam has found his way to the terrace at Collinwood and is being fascinated by the water fountain,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and tries to drink from it. And Mrs. Johnson finds him, who's been calling for David,
Yeah.
And she starts shouting and, being like Miss Johnson does. And
mm-hmm.
Barnabas and Julia come to the rescue, but Adam's already gone. And Mrs. Johnson's nerves are already shot, and she decides that she's going to leave Collinwood for her safety as well as David's.
Yeah. Barnabas and Willie finally find Adam in the woods after a while and take him back to the old house. And Julia gives him a sedative.
Gives
him a sedative in drink form, but it doesn't last long because Adam is a big guy and he's got a lot of...
It takes a lot to sedate him.
strength, And he realizes he's chained up. Even in his infant mind, he realizes that this is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And Willie brings him something to eat. He's kind of a weenie about it.
Yeah.
He is.
He is.
He's terrified of him for no real reason at this point. But Adam throws the tray of food off of his bed, and Willie gets spooked again easily, and he just runs out.
I mean, I think that Willie has been through a lot. I mean, the last time we saw Willie, he was getting shot in the back. He barely lived.
Right.
If it hadn't been for Dr. Woodard, he'd be dead.
Yeah.
He's just recently been at Wyncliffe, so I don't think Willie was the best person to take care of Adam because I don't think that Willie was in the best mental state.
Yeah, of course, no.
I think that Willie has a lot of PTSD
Yeah.
from everything that's happened to him up until this point, you know,
Yeah.
being under Barnabas's power and Barnabas kind of abusing him at first, you know, and then, you know, the whole thing with Maggie and, you know, having to keep that secret and we killed that girl, Barnabas, you know, dealing with that and then being shot in the back, you know, it's a lot for one person, you know, it's amazing that he's still standing, but he even tells Julia, he's like, I'd rather be at Wincliffe than take care of this guy, you know, and Julia tells him, he's like, if you don't go back and take care of him, I won't allow you to come back out and I'll declare you incurable. And I'm like, damn, Julia, that was a Barnabas thing just now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that Barnabas would have threatened.
Yeah.
So, but what Willie learns that Adam likes things that are shiny and sparkly, you know, and opens up the secret panel to show him some jewelry. Yeah. And Adam spots Josette's earrings, those beautiful green earrings that Joan Bennett had on in the very first scene of Dark Shadows. Yeah. And he remembers that she wore these when Barnabas held her captive. And he takes the earrings and goes to the Evans cottage. He sneaks in and leaves them in Maggie's purse for her to find, you know. And this is the start of Maggie being obsessed with those earrings. And it definitely drives the wedge between her and Joe. You know, she's so obsessed with these. And he's like, will you please just put these things down? Just put them down. Yeah. And they remind her of something that she's forgotten, but she can't seem to remember, you know. And Maggie does, I mean, this is getting ahead, but she does eventually remember. Yeah. You know, she makes trips to the old house, you know, because the earrings lead her there and she can't figure out why. But I mean, Joe steals them out of her purse and has them appraised because he's worried they're stolen property, you know, and they're very old and very, 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 very expensive, you know, and whatever. It drives a wedge between her and Joe. Yeah. But Julia has brought Eric Lang's tape recorder to Adam so that he can listen to the music. And again, they still don't know about the hidden message that Eric left for Julia, but Adam hears it and eventually learns to say Barnabas's name. And Barnabas is like, what? Where did you learn that? You know, like Barnabas had brought him some food or whatever, but he only stays for a moment. And when he leaves, Adam is upset and like ends up breaking the chain off the wall and then breaking through the door. Yeah. I mean, Adam is very strong. And I mean, this was very Frankenstein-like, you know, he made the guy very strong, but I'm not sure why Eric Lang felt the need to make him so strong. I don't know.
I don't even know if that might have been part of the plan. It was just
maybe just something like a side effect or something. Yeah. But Adam he was a big guy. He was tall, had the biggest hands I've ever seen. And it was, I don't know. I don't know, but he does escape again. This is, you know, another time where he escapes and runs into David. Yeah. David goes out to play and Roger stops and has a little chat with him. Nothing to write home about or anything. But this scene, apparently Cassandra has been working Roger because she has told Roger that Barnabas is not kind to her. And he was like, why aren't you kind to my wife? You treat everyone else around here nicely. He was like, why can't you? And Barnabas was like, okay. Doesn't really defend himself over it, you know, doesn't really defend himself, but he tells Barnabas, you know, treat her better or you shouldn't come around anymore. Yeah. And Barnabas was like, okay, I'll rectify the situation. And I'm not sure if he means it entirely because he knows who she is, but I don't know. I just don't know. Elizabeth she's out walking the grounds. I think she was on her way to the old house, but she runs into Adam in the woods. She runs away, but before she does, he says the only word he knows, Barnabas. And she runs back to Collinwood to tell the men about who she saw and that he said Barnabas. And Roger remembers that David went out to play and holy crap, you know, David's out there somewhere. So he grabs a gun and heads out, you know. And Adam finds David. He does find David outside playing with his brand new knife that Cassandra got for him. And David isn't frightened by Adam. Like, he's like, hey, he's like, get over here, you know, and isn't afraid of him. He's like, you're really tall. And you know, thinks that he's a foreigner is what David said.
And again, it's that classic Frankenstein scene, you know, with the little girl by the river, you know, by the lake. And she's not terrified of him. She's like, wow, you're a really big dude, you know. What's your name, you know? It was that moment. So.
I mean, he even invites him to play with him, you know, come play with me. Here's the object of the game, you know. But, you know, Adam is fascinated by his knife and, you know, David sprains his ankle. And so Adam picks him up I think in his, his childlike way, like wanted to help, wasn't sure what to do, but picked him up because David was obviously in pain. And that's right about where Roger shows up with the gun. Mm-hmm. But Barnabas is like, don't shoot. You might hit David, Right. But, and Barnabas is able, put him down. He's a good boy. Put him down, Mm-hmm. And he does. And once David is clear, Roger takes a shot and does hit Adam, hits him in the shoulder. He runs back to Collinwood, and Cassandra and Julia have just been out with Professor Stokes discussing the occult, and they're all excited about it. And wow, what a great conversation! And they arrive back at Collinwood when Roger is talking to the police about the incident, and Julia is hearing him describe the man, and she gets these wide eyes, and she looks at Cassandra. She's like, "Please excuse me, mm-hmm. Please excuse me" to Roger. She realizes that they're talking about Adam, She figures that Adam would probably run back to the old house, like a child. It's like a child running home. Yeah. When you're hurt, and I don't know.
But she was right. They end up finding him back in his room with a gunshot wound in his arm. Mm-hmm. He ran back to the only home he knew, just like a child. Yeah, yeah. And skipping ahead a little bit after that, Mrs. Johnson, still isn't able to stay away and shows up at the old house.
She's been in Boston for, we're not sure how long. We don't know if it was just 24 hours or if it was a couple of days. We just know that it wasn't very long. Yeah. We don't know how much time has lapsed because this is a new episode, and the first, the opening scene is Mrs. Johnson coming through the doors of the old house. Yeah. Looking for Julia. Yeah. And but she's ready. She's ready to find David and tell him the dream. She cannot handle this anymore. Take it anymore. And Julia tries to send her away, but Mrs. Johnson waits outside the old house for David. Because David shows up while she's there, and Mrs. Julia pushes her out the door.
For the tape recorder, right?
Yeah. And she's, pushes Mrs. Johnson out the door, but she waits for David. Yeah. And he does have the dream. He does. Yeah. And Willie is his summoner, and Mrs. Johnson waits for him to wake up because she knows the terror that he's experiencing at this moment. Mm-hmm. She waits for him, stays with him by his bed while he has the dream, and waits for him with open arms because she knows he's going to wake up and freak out. And he runs into her arms, and just another testament of Mrs. Johnson. Yeah. She didn't just tell him the dream, feel relieved, and leave again. It was just, I don't know, it warmed my heart to see that, Yeah. He woke up and there she was ready for him to jump into her arms, So that was also an end of an episode. The next episode, we open up at the old house, and there's Willie sitting on the steps of the old house. We don't see this. This has already happened. Yeah. David has already told Willie the dream. Yes. So Willie he's distracted by it. He hasn't even had the dream, and he's all he's doing is thinking about it. He hasn't even had the dream yet. And Barnabas, he tells Barnabas, I'm going to have a dream. And Barnabas is like, oh, crap. So he gets this brilliant idea. He asks Willie to go to Collinwood and get the portrait of Angelique. Mm-hmm. And he wants to know if Angelique controls the portrait, or if the portrait controls Angelique, or if they're one and the same. Yeah. So he asks him to go get the portrait, and then he writes a letter. It's like, while you're at Collinwood, give this letter to Cassandra. Yeah. And asking Cassandra to meet him at the old house at 10 o'clock that night. And Barnabas heads over to Sam Evans with the painting. Yeah. And asks him if he would do this work for him without any questions asked. I will give you $500, no questions asked, if you'll just do what I say. Mm-hmm. And Sam was like, $500 for one night's work? I can't really turn that down. Yeah. What do you need? Right. Here I am. Yep. Barnabas asks Sam to age the portrait, but very slowly. Yeah. And use a really hard, pointy, sharp brush while you do it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And don't start till
10:15.
10:15.
That Sam does have his questions, and Barnabas is like, remember our agreement? He's like, okay. I need one question answered, just one. He was like, when do I stop? Yeah. When do I stop aging this portrait? And Barnabas is like, when you think she looks about 200 years old, then you can stop. Okay. And he was like, okay. All right. So Cassandra's late. She's supposed to be there at 10 o'clock. She doesn't show up till like 10 minutes after. Mm-hmm. And she was like, I was helping Vicky. She's like, the portrait seems to be missing. And she's like, or stolen, and looks at Barnabas, and he was like, okay. He was like, how fortunate. Oh, how unfortunate. I love that. I couldn't tell if that was a mess up from Jonathan Frid or if it was on purpose. Like, whatever, it fit. It was great. Right. So Barnabas tells her, he's like, the reason I asked you here is to tell you that you've made a mistake letting it go this long. And she's like, what are you talking about? She's like, are you going to start on this again? And she was like, he's like, letting me live this long or putting the curse on me, whatever you plan to do. You've let it go on too long. And at that moment is when Sam starts to paint, and Cassandra begins to feel pain in her eyes and in her cheeks and around her lips. And when Barnabas calls her Angelique, she doesn't correct him the second time.
Yeah.
And he was like, and he tells her, he's like, you're going to start aging and it's going to spread to the rest of your body. You know, look at your hands.
Look at your hands.
Yeah. And her hands are all aged and gross looking. And so
she runs out to the place of power, the gazebo.
Must be.
And she summons Tony, and he sees a very aged Cassandra, and she begins to put him in a trance with his lighter. She begins asking who Barnabas could have asked to paint the age lines on the portrait.
Yeah.
He produces 2 artists, and Sam Evans is the most likely.
Right. She doesn't ask him for much. She just wants some information.
Yeah.
And she figures, you know, Angelique's not a dumb girl. She's smart. She figures, you know, for it to be effective, it would have to be someone who knows their painting, who can paint and can paint well. So what artist do you know that the Collins have dealt with? And, you know, he produced Sam Evans and is like, you know, Sam, they're very close with the Collinses. And she, well, has he done any work for them? He's like, yeah, he painted Barnabas a couple of years ago. She's like, bingo.
Yeah. Yeah.
So...
And at this moment, Carolyn catches the 2 of them.
Yeah.
On the terrace there, and what looks like canoodling.
Yeah, she doesn't really know, but.
And Tony attempts, of course, to defend them, but she's not buying it, you know.
Yeah, and she stays pissed off at Tony. She stays pissed off.
Yeah.
Like he calls up to Collinwood, and Elizabeth was like, "Oh yeah, Carolyn." She's like, "If that's Tony, I don't want to talk to him." And it kind of reminded me of. Of beginning Dark Shadows when she's got this thing being obsessed with Burke and she's being very petty. That's what this kind of reminds me of. And Liz again tries to push her straight. You know, it's like, you need to stop acting like this. Stop doing this. You know, but I don't know. That's just kind of what it reminded me of.
Yeah. But immediately after that, Cassandra runs off to Sam Evans' cottage.
Yeah.
And she demands her painting, and he refuses to give it to her. She warns him not to refuse, but he doesn't listen.
Yeah.
And she urges him to try to finish it, but he won't be able to. And that's when he loses his sight.
Yeah, when the thing happens.
She walks
to
out
Sam
the door
Evans.
and he's blind.
The thing is, though, she didn't blind him immediately. She said, try to finish.
The second you try to finish.
He said the second he picked up his paintbrush, his vision went dark. And
yes.
It wasn't just like, okay, you're blind. It was like, try to finish.
Yeah.
And
Maggie finds him, and she walks in the house, finds him, and immediately calls a doctor. But Sam demands that she just calls Barnabas.
And get him here.
Get him here.
And I mean, he's very forceful about it too. You know, it kind of reminds me of when someone is disabled pretty sudden like, and they're very bitter about it. And this is kind of how Sam hit me when it happened.
Definitely.
And, you know, Maggie can't just pick up the phone and call Barnabas because there's no phone at the old house. So she has to go down there and get him. And it's, but Julie is the one who answers the door, and she was like, he needs you more, but he wants to see Barnabas. So can you both come, you know? And she tells her what's happened. And Willie is taunting Adam with the jewels again. And calls him stupid. He's like, you're just stupid, Adam. You know, just being very bully-like to Adam, because he can be. You know, Willie hasn't had a lot of people in his life that he's been able to overpower. Burke Devlin kicked his butt, you know, and Joe has already had a stab at him too because he showed up at Maggie's house. And, you know, so I think that this is kind of a way for Willie to feel like a man.
Right.
But Barnabas catches him being a bully, and Barnabas looks through the jewel chest and can't find Josette's earrings, and you know, immediately blames Willie because, you know, he's the likely suspect, and Willie gets all butthurt about it, even though he is the one that stole them.
Yeah.
He was like, whatever, Barnabas, I quit. Throws the necklace back in his hand. He's like, you can't quit. Where would you go? Back to Wincliffe, you know? So, you know, Barnabas does. And so this is happening while Maggie is showing up and telling Julia the situation, and Sam wants to speak to Barnabas before Julia examines him. And I want to speak to him alone. And he's like, oh, I expected you were in on this too, Dr. Hoffman. And she was like, what happened? I don't even know. I'm just getting here. And like she's listening to the conversation. She obviously had no idea what happened. And Barnabas went to Sam and asked him to age the portrait. Sam did exactly what he was asked to do for the $500.
Yeah.
And while I do think this was very clever on Barnabas's part to figure out what he needed to do with Angelique and how to defeat her, I do think it was very clever. He figured out the painting.
Yeah.
I do believe Sam had every right to be so angry with him.
Absolutely.
It's like, it didn't cost Barnabas anything, but it cost Sam his sight. And when Julia examined him, it was very clear to Julia, even though she didn't want to tell Sam, that it was likely permanent. It's just that the nerve endings of the optic, they're very pale. His sight isn't coming back. And this is when Barnabas mentions, man, I sure wish Eric Lang were still alive. I bet he could fix this, know. And Sam blames Barnabas because Barnabas, the portrait seemingly belonged to Barnabas, but it didn't. And, Barnabas tried to, I had permission, blah, 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 and
felt like he was lied to. And
it felt betrayed. And that was a perfectly fair feeling, I think.
Absolutely.
Sam, he was like, what's a painter without his eyesight? I can't paint if I can't see. So Sam basically lost everything in that one night.
Yeah.
Because Barnabas, needed him. And I really did feel bad for Barnabas in the situation. He feels like he destroyed another life. But Julia comes back almost immediately with, well, you've suffered too. And while I think she's absolutely right, I do think that this only adds to his suffering. That, someone else is suffering too. He knows the pain he's been through, but I think Barnabas thinks that for all the suffering he's been through, he's also caused just as much suffering to others. And in this moment, he feels a lot of guilt about what happened to Sam. Yeah. And knowing that Angelique caused this to happen to Sam, Barnabas wonders what Angelique will do when she finds out about Adam.
Right.
So,
right.
I don't know. We got a little bit more to talk about. We're almost halfway through this.
Yeah.
So next week we'll come back with part 3. This is our first more than 2-parter here.
Yeah.
But it is the Dream Curse and it goes on forever and ever. We know this. But thank you again for giving us your time. Thank you for reaching out to us with your comments. I just want to remind all of you who follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and wherever else you would listen to audio. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, there is some exclusive content there that you won't get on the regular streaming services. So head over and like and subscribe. It does help us grow the podcast, and we would be ever so grateful. But until then, everyone, remember to keep it between us and the shadows. Good night.
Good night. Through sight and sound and faceless terror, through endless corridors by trial and error, ahead a blazing light does burn, and one door leads to the point of return.
You've been listening to Between the Shadows, a Dark Shadows podcast. All original Dark Shadows music, video clips, images, and media are the sole property of Dan Curtis Productions and is only used to promote Dark Shadows and should not be distributed, copied, or reproduced.